Hello, and welcome to another segment of the Coatesville Area Public Library's Oral History Project. I'm Kirk Witmer, and with me today I have Reverend William W. Speigelhalder, who has been a pastor here in the Coatesville community for quite a number of years. Pastor, good to have you with us today.
Thank you.
You first came to Coatesville in 1964.
Right.
And you served as pastor of the Olivet Methodist Church at 3rd and Chestnut Street for 23 years.
True.
Now, to hold that position and that tenure has a certain distinction with it. Tell us about that.
It was a time when we came to Coatesville that the churches were starting to go through some major changes, and we sort of lived through those changes while we were here. While we were here, the two Lutheran churches, of course, merged and built a new church that is now located off, I think, 13th Avenue, up in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time when, for me, there was a lot of ecumenical progress.
Tell me about that.
Well, unfortunately, when we arrived in Coatesville, I was shocked to find that we had a ministerium made up of a select group of clergymen, and they were white Protestant. I attended the ministerium, and when I asked the question why we did not have Roman Catholics and blacks, I was told that they just weren't part of it. Kenneth Deerstein, who was a chaplain at the Veterans Hospital at that time, was part of the ministerium, and he too was concerned about this. And we decided that we were going to try to have the group extend an invitation to all the clergy, regardless of their religious background, if they were churches or synagogues or religiously oriented groups believing in God, that they ought to have a voice. And we did. And as a result of that, we had the wonderful experience of having the Roman Catholics and the black clergymen come into the ministerium. And it wasn't long, about 3 or 4 years later, Reverend Alonzo Baxter, who was a very fine black pastor in town, became the president of that group. I was president prior to, he was vice president when I was president, and he and several other black ministers came in, were a vital part of the ministerium for many years. Also, at that same time, the Roman Catholics came into the ministerium, and that was a first. I think that some of the blacks had some exposure before in a very nominal way, but this was a real first when the Roman Catholics came in. And that proved to be a very worthwhile experience and has continued, I understand, until today. One of the things we did at first was to have the community services on Thanksgiving. And it was a wonderful experience to have a Thanksgiving community service on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving in the synagogue with a Roman Catholic priest preaching. So, you know, we did come a long way when we were able to do
Certainly.
that. And then we had also all the denominations, all the faiths got together. And for a few years, over in one of the Roman Catholic churches in the West End, I think it was St. Joseph, I remember the name correctly, we would have community meetings once a month. And at those meetings, we would discuss a community issue, like young people's work or maybe elderly people in the churches or projects for the poor. And they were quite popular for a long time. And they didn't continue in that same format, but they did continue. I know one of the things they did for many years was they would have progressive dinners, and all the churches and religious groups were invited, and you came to one church for the appetizer and went to another religious home for the soup, and another one for the main course. And they were very popular for a while. And that way you got to sit down with people from other churches and other faiths. And while I was here, I saw a lot of progress in the ecumenical movement. And just before I left, which I understand has continued and is a vital part of the ecumenical spirit today, they started a community. Well, it wasn't community in the sense it was sponsored by the Catholic Church, but they invited all of the other Protestant groups to come in. And now I understand they have and have had a Good Friday service where they, instead of having it in the church, they go to certain sites that would correspond to the theme they're trying to celebrate at that particular moment. And that is done as a pilgrimage. And all of the church, not all, but many of the churches, I understand, are a part of that today. So that was interesting, and it's good to know that that spirit's continuing.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing that with us, because I know as a boy, my memories are that we did not have this fellowship among congregations. We certainly had social interaction on an individual level, but for whole churches to share with each other was just something that was very rare, if it happened at all, in earlier years. So I'm glad to have a little more background on how that movement began here in Coatesville. I'm sure that in the 23 years that you spent as pastor of the church in Coatesville, and I should mention that is the longest pastorate for the Olivet Methodist Church in its history, you've seen a number of changes in the community itself, in businesses and architecture. What were your impressions of the look and feel of Coatesville when you first arrived in '64?
I sensed very rapidly that the downtown area was changing. And what I want to make sure to make very clear is it doesn't mean when you're having a change that it means the town is going down, because many of the times when you have changes that would indicate it's a backward step. At the same time, on the other side, you have a forward step. And Coatesville, as well as many other towns, when they see major changes taking place, they seem to overcloud the progressive things that take place and the improvements that are taking place. Now, I remember when I came into Coatesville, and I brought my family, we came in from the out there where 82 and Kings Highway. And at that time, it was a very old, narrow road, and that section started to deteriorate, and it wasn't a very sort of pretty picture to come into Coatesville. And my children thought, oh, where are we moving? But that, of course, was replaced with the nice four-lane highway now that we have coming into Coatesville, which makes a big difference to a visitor coming in,
Sure.
to have that nice highway and some of the scenery there that you have. So that was a major change that took place very rapidly, and I think was a good change as far as coming to Coatesville. Then where we lived at 3rd Avenue and Chestnut Street, that was going through a rapid change, in that those big mansions that had been there throughout the year, and I'm sure some of your people you interviewed have spoken of some of those mansions, they had started to change to be turned into apartment houses. And also doctors' offices. That was called Doctors' Row in there when I came, because it seemed for several years that that was a place to have a doctor's office between 3rd and 5th Avenue on Chestnut Street. But while I was there, that changed because of the new hospital and the physicians' building at the hospital, which is good sense to have them together in an area like that. But that did remove that element of the professional life. And now, not completely, there are still some doctors there, we're glad of that. but many of them did leave to go to the professional building. Also,
Let me ask you,
yeah.
why, in your opinion, do you feel that that was? Were the doctors just unsatisfied to be on Chestnut Street, or?
No, I think that it was just easier to have them in one place and to have them related to the hospital, because many times when, you know, you were in the hospital, you were treated by the doctors who were in that building, and it just seemed a good link. I don't think it was any dissatisfaction. I think it was just a good link that they considered it to be that. And they also, I think doctors work together more than most people realize, just like ministers work together more than most people realize. And I think that it was an advantage to have them there together, where they could refer to one another, you know, refer patients who needed specialized treatment.
Transportation in Coatesville has changed quite a lot, too.
Yes, I saw that change quite a bit, and the major change I saw was in the Coatesville station, the railroad station. When I came to Coatesville, there were quite a few trains a day. You could go out almost, not every hour, but not much more than that. Within 2 hours, you could always get a train to Philadelphia or Harrisburg. And then they seem, and there would be a good crowd when you go to the station, where a lot of people would get off the train or get on the train. And the numbers seem to diminish. I think the biggest reason is because of the parking. More and more people went to Downingtown because they could park their cars there and go into the city and come back. I think that was the biggest reason. There were some changes in the community there, which I think have been exaggerated, but I think the biggest reason was the parking. And however, today, I know when I travel a train from Lancaster, there are very few trains stopping at Coatesville. A rather interesting part of it is when I came to Coatesville, and for several years, a lot of the people who would find a way of getting a ride on the train, I like to call them tramps, but they liked Coatesville to stop because they got such good treatment here, you know. And I averaged one a day. Now, not every day, but taking the average, I averaged about one a day because we're just one block from the station.
Yes, first church that they can see.
That's right. And they would come down and they would usually want transportation to the Veterans Hospital. And some of them had to have that because they couldn't walk up that hill. And if they couldn't get a taxi, it was a problem. And legitimately so, many of the people came wanting help there. But however, many of them came and said they were veterans who were not veterans, but they figured that was a good story and they would get a handout and get help. Many times, a minister's always haunted by whether or not he turns down somebody who really needed the help, because you get so many, and you know many of them are con people, and many of them do, you know, they're working the area. So they, some of them I suspected, you know, were not on the level, but if I was ever in doubt, I would always give them some help. And sometimes I'd look out the front door of the church and see them heading for the liquor store. So I would often go up and meet them in liquor stores. I thought you wanted that to feed your family. But over the years, then that started to diminish. But Coatesville, they got good treatment in Coatesville. And, but that leads me into another thought.
Yes.
And that is, we had the YMCA. When I came to Coatesville, the YMCA, their program was declining. When I say declining, I mean it was not as large as it had been, but it was still very active. And a great number of people, church people especially in Coatesville, would go to the cafeteria and eat their Sunday dinner there. That was sort of a reunion where people saw people who used to go to school with them and people who worked with them. And you went to the cafeteria, you saw an awful lot of people. Now that was in the middle 60s. And they were starting, however, to make plans to relocate it. But the nice thing about it is you always had a place. If you had people who legitimately needed help, you could call the YMCA. And what our church did, we would call and pay for a room for somebody to stay there overnight. And they were always very cooperative at the YMCA. But then when that closed, there was no place in Coatesville that you could house anyone overnight. And the closest motel at that time was down around Exton. So that became a real problem, and for several years, we would have to put them on the train and send them to Lancaster to the Water Street Mission, which wasn't too large at that time, but they would always keep somebody for 3 nights. They had a lot of work up there on the farms and things like that. And if somebody wanted to work and went there, they would get them a job. So we would send them up there. But then in the, I would say in the early 80s, the old Lutheran church over in the West End had been taken over by another church group. And they opened a shelter at night for people who were passing through or needed help. They would give them an evening meal, and they could sleep there overnight. So then the churches would send people over there. And that operated for several years and very successfully and filled a real need in Coatesville.
Pastor, I have to ask you, one of the major duties of a pastor is visiting the sick and shut-in, and that oftentimes takes place in a hospital. You were doing a lot of visitations in the old Coatesville Hospital on Strode Avenue,
Right.
and then I'm sure when the Brandywine Hospital was built, you were doing your visits there.
True.
Compare and contrast for me, if you would, the two hospitals.
Well, the old hospital, it was still in the days when you had wards when I came here. You'd have a ward. I remember one of the wards must have had at least 12 beds in it. And, but that was very common in most hospitals at that time. And we've moved from that. Well, naturally, when they moved to the new hospital, you don't have wards there. You have semi-private, and you probably have maybe one or a few rooms where you have more than 2, but the majority of 1 or 2. It was very common, though, in the old hospital. There were several wards, and that was one of the major changes. And of course, the new hospital was built for a hospital in the day it was built, so that it is a little better, well, it was better organized as far as the various departments of the hospital, would be concerned. The parking, while we had quite a bit of parking at the old hospital, if the front part of it was filled, you had to go to the back. And sometimes that was a problem for some people, so that I think your parking is a lot better. So that it was nice to know that the old hospital became a retirement facility such as it is today. And I know many people have been very happy there and like the idea of not having to move out of Coatesville when they had lived all their lives in Coatesville. So that it's nice it became. And then we had the nursing school at the hospital, the old hospital, and the nurses used to come over to our church. And at that time, they were able to come. But while I was here, the schedules changed so that so many of them had Sunday duties that we didn't have as many in recent years as we did in the early years when I was here. But the nurses had a nice relationship with the churches when they could go. The churches took a real interest in the nurses. And sometimes if we had a nurse, who was from a distance, we would try to have some of these nurses in our homes on Thanksgiving and times when they couldn't go home.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting to note that your comment about seniors that have moved into the Harrison Retirement Facility are grateful to have a place that allows them to remain within Coatesville. I think there's something about Coatesville that tends to get in the blood of a native Coatesvillian and makes you want to stay. What are your impressions of that comment?
Well, I think that's very true. I noticed when I was here that some people who had moved out into the country, they moved back into Coatesville when they became older. One reason was it was more convenient, and then another reason is that they, I think, like the feeling of being in town. I think the new retirement center, I think it was called Freedom Village.
Yes.
Yes, I think that really many people who went up there feel that it's part of Coatesville, and that was the reason for choosing it, because they didn't want to get too far away from Coatesville. So that people do have strong roots. When I came to Coatesville, they told me there was a time when every member of that church could walk to church. Well, when I came as 64, there were many who couldn't walk, they had to drive. But then over the years, more and more of them moved out in the country. But this happened not only in Coatesville, it happens in all towns. People think when their children are growing up, oh, we'd like to get outside of town, we'd like to get outside of town. But it's amazing how many of them, when they get outside of town, say, I don't know about what we shouldn't have stayed in town. They have bringing the children to everything, and the things were located in the central part of the town at that time. And I found that more and more people, of course, had to drive. But the thought I want to leave with you is that even though they moved out, many of them had churches very close to where they moved. They wanted to come back to their Coatesville church, to their roots. That's one reason I stayed in Coatesville 23 years, because the bishop said to me, that church has every reason to be going down because people are moving out. But he said it isn't. And he said, while the church is still going ahead there, he said, as long as you want to stay and the people want you to stay, I'm going to send you back. So it was a good experience. And that also shows that there are a lot of things in Coatesville that are still very sound and solid and growing. And while we were there, we saw the apartment house in back of the church on Main Street there. We saw that built for senior citizens.
Coatesville Towers.
Yes, I couldn't remember the name, Coatesville Towers. And that was a real addition to Coatesville. Many of those people came over to our church. Many of them contribute to the community. I know when I was here, a lot of them were involved in volunteer service at various places in Coatesville, and it was a real plus. Now I understand they've added some others since I've gone. There's down, I don't know what they call it, there's one down on Chestnut Street that has been built, where many of our people used to live in those homes. But it looks like a very nice facility, and that's another real plus for Coatesville. Also, the library, the new library came into being while we were in Coatesville, and that was a real addition. A lot of people use the library in Coatesville. I know my family used to use it, and I used it too. And I was always amazed the great number of people who used the Coatesville Library, and it's a good library. And there would be times when I would hear people say that they had gone to surrounding libraries for some information that they felt our library wouldn't have. It was because it was small, and ended up finding it in our library, and they couldn't find it.
In others.
So it's a good library, and it was a good addition to Coatesville, and I was glad to see that.
Well, on the topic of the library, I think it is interesting to note that with the technological advances that have been made in library science, there are ways now that allow you to pretty much consider Coatesville your own public library,
Right.
the gateway to the entire county library system. So that has certainly been a plus. You have been essentially away from our community for about 12 years now. I know you do come back for visits on a regular basis. But in those 12 years, have there been any surprising changes that you have noticed from when you left in '87?
Well, there have been several. One is, of course, the change at Lucan's. That was such a strong organization and industry, and the change, of course, it being sold, that was something that was a big change, I think, for the community. The Lucan's organization, the industry, I think they did so much more for the community than the community knew, because they didn't always make a big splash when they helped a lot of projects in the town. You know, when I was here, they helped an awful lot. They funded a lot of good things that they never made a big deal about it, but I, in my work, saw the support that they gave. And I know that there must be change and mergers and industries must be sold, but that was a big change that I was sorry really to see take place, that Lucan sort of lost its identity. That would be a negative one. I think the schools, however, are to be congratulated because of the new schools that have been built, the expansion of the schools. I mean, there's so many courses that are offered now for some of the particular studies that people want to take, specialized word I want to use, training, that can now be experienced in Coatesville that were not here. And they've been added along the way. I have a granddaughter in the school, and I think that that's a real plus, that our schools have advanced and are keeping up with, you know, the times, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that I'm glad to see that. Even though the transportation isn't what it used to be, maybe there'll be some changes that'll take place in that. I think the historical emphasis has been good in Coatesville, because I know there are several groups in Coatesville who are concerned with preservation, historic preservation, and some of the buildings that are very meaningful, you know, by their history, are still here and some of them are being developed. I think that. So, and every now and then I hear some things that are positive about just little happenings, you know, in the community. But the parades are still held.
Yes, they are.
And that's a tradition. And that's another thing, is I think Coatesville realistically uses tradition to make a contribution to people's lives. There are many traditional things that are done. Some of them have disappeared, like the old Thanksgiving football game that was always held. I know that was
always
that was a sacred thing.
Yes.
But some changes do take place, and we have to remember that. But as I said in the beginning, we have to remember too that many times changes are good changes, and we've seen some of that happen. I think there are signs throughout the town, sections of the town, where there's renewal. I think down on 3rd Avenue, for instance, for a while. Now, see, at one time, that was a very old residential street, and that's where the first parsonage was for all the United Methodist Church, was down there. And then after several years, they moved it up near the church. But that was not a section that seemed to improve for a while. Then in the last several years, I've noticed several new buildings there, several new businesses, and several changes. So that in some towns there are streets that have cycles, And it's just like in organizations, you know, you have cycles many times when something will be strong or something will be weak. And you have to remember that. And a town goes through cycles sometimes. And it's always good to be on the upward side of the cycle, however, a good feeling. But I think, too, that in Coatesville, there were a lot of character-building organizations that did a good job. I know the Scouts, they've always had a lot of good scouting work in Coatesville. We had them at our church for many years. And they made a contribution as a good organization. A lot of good scout leaders in Coatesville who, through the years, have made a contribution. And scouting was a strong point in Coatesville. And then there were some of the churches that had, something else that took place when I was here that I think was significant. And this would have been, I would say, in the late 70s. The young people wanted to have a center where they could gather for good, wholesome fun and relaxation. And we had a coffee house. And the coffee house was down in the basement of, I'm trying to think what the building was then. It was down around 5th, what was that building?
Was it the YWCA?
Yes, that was it. That's where it was, the YWCA. The YWCA, right, it was in the YWCA. And they were very, very kind. And for several years, they had a good coffee house there. They have a couple hundred every Saturday night. I remember Jane Deerstein was one of the pioneers of that. She is now an ordained clergywoman in the Methodist Church.
It's funny you should mention that because I personally worked very closely with Jane on that project. That actually occurred in 1967.
Was it that early?
67, yes.
Oh, I thought it was later than that. I'm glad that you have that date down. Well, that's good. I thought you were in it, but I thought it was, of course, we're all older, and we think, you know, because the nice thing about leaving a place where you've lived is no one ever gets any older.
Yeah, right.
Because you always think of them of the age. Just when I think of you, I always think of you as a kid, see. When I was here, you were a boy. You were growing up. And that's one of the nice things when you leave a place. Everybody stays the same age as when you live there.
And we're all older than we think we are.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Pastor Speigelhalder, I want to thank you very much for being a part of our project. Your comments, particularly regarding the ecumenical advances that we've made as a community, are treasured. And I think it's important that we include those as part of the history of Coatesville. That's a very important part of the history of Coatesville. And I can't thank you enough for being with us today on this project.
Well, thank you. We feel Coatesville made a real contribution to our lives. And 2 of our children, of course, were part of the school system and have very fond memories and like to come back to Coatesville. Of course, some of our families still live around here, so we do sort of know something about what's going on.
I'm sure you do.
And we're always glad to hear the good things taking place.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.